The social contracts that exist in business, as well as in every aspect of our life, are based on something called the trust principle. Let's take a look at that definition. Very simply, the trust principle is the concept that all human relationships are based on trust. When we look at the trust principle as it exists in our day-to-day business lives, we see that it comes into play constantly. When we go on a job interview, we trust that the employer is interviewing us in good faith, and likewise, the employer trusts that we are there in good faith. When we have a meeting with prospective clients, we trust that the client believes that he or she has a problem for which we may have the solution. When we deal with coworkers, there is a basic trust that we're dealing with each other fairly and equitably. When the trust breaks down, the consequences can be severe. These consequences are discussed in detail later in this course. Within the trust principle, there are two distinct types of trust: explicit trust and implied trust. Explicit trust is categorized as the trust principles that are specifically defined by a verbal or written agreement. We deal with explicit trusts every day. Sometimes they appear in the form of employment agreements, employee handbooks, customer contracts, and even internal memos. Generally, explicit trusts are clean-cut and not open to interpretation. They're black and white and are either upheld or broken. The other type of trust we mentioned is implied trust. Implied trust is very different from explicit trust. Implied trust is summarized as the trust principles that are generally accepted but not specifically outlined in a written or oral agreement. They are implied. Just as explicit trust is more like a written contract, implied trust is more like the social contracts we deal with every day. A simple but poignant example is when we're walking to our door with our arms filled with grocery bags and there's someone standing close to the door that sees us. We trust that that person will take it upon themselves to open the door for us. When he or she doesn't, we feel slighted. It is the same in our business lives. There is an implied trust that we can expense business lunch. It's actually for business purposes. When we take the time and the effort to prepare a document and send it to a coworker or supervisor for comments, we trust that they'll actually read the document. An additional concept to consider before we begin looking at the different types of social contracts that exist in business is the concept of trust versus betrayal. What happens when we don't honor a trust? Not honoring a trust is a betrayal of the person who created the trust. It's not a betrayal of the trust, but a betrayal of the person who granted the trust. When an individual neglects to honor a trust in a business context, that individual is essentially committing a personal foul against their trusting colleague. And that may open up the untrustworthy person to many types of negative consequences.